It's often said that you will be judged by the company you keep. Today, the head of the European Union paid a visit to the president of Ukraine. The message was clear: we have a future together. Now, earlier this year, the presidents of Russia and China celebrated their country's new relationship, one with no limits. But that was before Russia became a political pariah waging war. Today, as the two leaders met again, another saying came to mind, that maybe it's better to be alone than in bad company. I'm Brent, Goff in Berlin. This is The Day.
You have your European friends by your side as long as it takes.
What I would like to see is that anyone who meets with Vladimir Putin reminds him of the obligation that international leaders have to uphold the international rules of law.
China is willing to make efforts to work with Russia as great powers.
We highly appreciate the balanced position of our Chinese friends in connection with the Ukrainian crisis.
We are friends forever. Thank you for having me here today.
Thank you so much.
Also coming up in London, the queues are 4, 5, 6 miles long. Thousands of people waiting in line to say goodbye to the Queen.
But just going in there and just seeing her, it was just lovely. She's at peace now. I just feel I've done something which I think is right, just to pay my respects.
To our viewers watching on PBS in the United States and to all of you around the world, welcome. We begin the day with the impact of war on relationships. Today, the world's two most powerful authoritarian leaders, the presidents of Russia and China, came together on the sidelines of a business summit. It was their first face-to-face meeting between Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin since the Russian invasion of Ukraine began back in February. Now, while the Chinese leader said nothing about the war publicly, Russian President Vladimir Putin made cryptic comments suggesting that Beijing and Moscow may not see eye to eye. Now, this is important because at the start of the year, Russia and China declared a new bilateral relationship without limits. It's seen as an attempt to build a bulwark against the U.S. and Western influence. Now, contrast these two leaders to the leaders of the European Union and Ukraine who came together today in Kyiv. The optics and the messaging here, they were crystal clear. Russia's invasion has brought Brussels and Kyiv closer together. We have more now in this report.
Like a meeting between old friends. On her third visit to Ukraine since the war began, Ursula von der Leyen received a warm welcome from President Volodymyr Zelensky and an award for her commitment to EU-Ukraine relations. Among the talking points, the 8 million plus people who fled to EU countries since the war began in February.
We want, of course, to give our Ukrainian friends, when they need help, as much support as possible. But we also know that they are longing to go home again.
Even as von der Leyen's night train made its way to Kyiv, Russian rockets struck a reservoir dam in Kryvyi Rih, an industrial center and President Zelensky's hometown. The resulting flood inundated several roads and houses, and the local drinking water supply was cut.
The drains aren't working and we can't flush the toilet. Everything's flooded and there's been no one from the Disaster Protection Agency here since yesterday evening.
President Zelensky said the Russian strikes on the city so close to his roots had no military value, and Zelensky said that fact shows Russia is intent on attacking Ukrainian civilians.
Well, DW's Nick Connolly, he has more now from the eastern Ukrainian city of Kharkiv.
Well, as you can probably see behind me, there is very little of Kharkiv to be seen at a pretty early evening hour because lots of people, it often feels in the centre like the majority have left, and the ones who are remaining are sticking to all the recommendations, keeping their curtains firmly shut and basically keeping off the streets. It's pretty extraordinary to be in a city of more than 1.5 million and occasionally only to see some cars passing a distance, a few very rare pedestrians. But it's a real contrast to the times before this war started. I was here in mid-February when the US government said that the war was imminent and people here just couldn't get their heads around it. They couldn't believe that this was on the cards, and this was a thriving city with also tens of thousands of foreign students coming here from around the world who also took their cue from the locals and were convinced that being 40 kilometres away from Russia didn't necessarily mean that they were in danger. Now, since this Ukrainian assault counteroffensive in the northeast of the country has done so well, we've seen some Russian retaliation attacks, we've seen attacks on the energy infrastructure, on the power system, the heating system rather, and extraordinarily it's proved pretty flexible and resilient and able to restore those systems. For the most part, power is back, the metro is operating, and even though, as I mentioned, so many people have left, those remaining are keeping the show on the road. But the question looking now towards the next few months is, even if Russian forces are no longer in this part of the country, they are still only, as you mentioned, they're 40 kilometres away on their own territory, so the risk of attacks, of missile attacks, of long-distance artillery, that is still very much there. Yesterday evening we heard a big explosion in the downtown not far from our hotel, and the air raid sirens only came on about 3-4 minutes afterwards. So often it's so difficult to really tell when these things are coming, and they're coming from such a short distance that the systems here just can't really give anyone a feeling of safety or the real chance to get to a position where they can be protected from damage. So it is a very edgy situation in a city that doesn't really quite know yet whether to believe that the situation is genuinely safer and whether it's kind of time to go back to some kind of normality.
That was Nick Connolly reporting there from Ukraine. When you think of war heroes, you probably think of soldiers, generals, medics. In the war in Ukraine, heroes also include postal workers who are providing a lifeline to people who live near the front lines, many of them elderly residents. Ukraine's mail service continues to deliver vital supplies in spite of all of the dangers. DW's Brigitte Schulke followed one letter carrier near Kharkiv. Well, from the ties that bind to ties that are being tested. Today, Russian President Vladimir Putin and his Chinese counterpart Xi Jinping held their first face-to-face talks since Moscow's invasion of Ukraine began earlier this year. Now, speaking on the sidelines of a summit in Uzbekistan, Putin thanked China for what he called its balanced position towards Ukraine. But Putin also acknowledged concerns, which some see as a cryptic confirmation that Beijing may be indifferent, perhaps even unhappy with Putin's war.
Vladimir Putin is in Samarkand to strengthen ties with the few allies he can count on. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization of Eurasian nations has grown in significance for Russia since its invasion of Ukraine led Western states to impose sanctions on Moscow. By far the most important meeting for Putin is with his Chinese counterpart Xi Jinping. It's the Chinese president's first foreign trip since the start of the coronavirus pandemic. China has remained tight-lipped over Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Putin was clearly thankful for the tacit support. We highly value the balanced position of our Chinese friends when it comes to the Ukraine crisis. Russia and China are presenting a united front when relations with Western states are going from bad to worse. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization includes many of the former Soviet republics in Central Asia, as well as India and Pakistan. Iran has expressed interest in joining. Turkey, whose president is attending the Samarkand summit, is a full dialogue partner. Putin and Erdogan are set to meet on Friday. Due to Western sanctions, Chinese products have replaced Western ones in Russia, while China is Russia's biggest oil customer. Xi Jinping sees the global role of the two countries as much more than just trade cooperation. China, together with Russia, is ready to accept the part of great powers and to play a leading role in being a force for stability and positive energy in a world shaken by social unrest. As their leaders talk in Uzbekistan, China and Russia are carrying out joint military exercises near the Pacific coast.
Well, my first guest tonight is Ali Wine, a senior analyst with Eurasia Group's macro geopolitics practice. His focus is on U.S.-China relations and competition between world powers. He's also the author of America's Great Power Opportunity, Revitalizing U.S. Foreign Policy to Meet the Challenges of Strategic Competition. And Ali joins me tonight from Washington, D.C. Ali, it's good to have you on the show. Let me ask you about what we heard or maybe what we didn't hear today. Vladimir Putin said that he understands that Xi Jinping has questions and concerns about the situation in Ukraine. What did you read between the lines there?
Well, thank you so much for having me on the program. So even if we often hear a distinction between the notes of music and the writing of the music, and that is to say, even though the relationship between China and Russia is deepening, the tenor of their conversations, the tenor of their public front is different than it was. You remember shortly before Russia invaded Ukraine, China and Russia famously declared that their friendship had no limits. But evidently, their relationship does have some limits. And I would just offer a few observations. I think that Vladimir Putin's statement is an acknowledgement of China's concerns. Not to say that China hasn't harbored those concerns, but that those concerns are growing. My hypothesis is that China probably thought that Russia was indeed going to launch either just a special military operation, or that if it did launch a full-fledged invasion of Ukraine, that Ukraine would capitulate right away. It would be a very bloodless and quick affair. The war hasn't turned out that way. It's much more protracted. It's proving to be a grind. And the longer this war goes on, to suffer. So I think that China is concerned about the trajectory of the war, and Russia that even if they publicly maintain a front of unity, I think that China wants Russia to make a renewed push to end hostilities.
And Ali, would you say that China is worried or is becoming more worried about the long-term fallout from Russia's invasion of Ukraine? I mean, is that at play here?
Absolutely. As I said just a minute ago, my sense is that China probably expected that Ukraine would capitulate very quickly. Ukraine, with Western support, has proven to be a formidable competitor. And of course, Russia's military as well has underperformed. So I think that China is very concerned. First of all, it's concerned by the same externalities of the war that many other countries are concerned about. It's concerned about disruptions to global energy markets. It's concerned about disruptions to global food markets. So it's concerned about those externalities, which will only worsen as the war continues. But it is also concerned about, as I mentioned, its transatlantic ties. And although China and Russia, they will strengthen their embrace to offset growing pressure from advanced industrial democracies, particularly in the West, China recognizes that for its own long-term strategic outlook, stable relations with the West are going to be far more consequential than stable relations with Russia. So China has a very difficult balancing act. And Evan Medeiros has famously referred to this as China's Russia policy trilemma. China simultaneously wants to demonstrate that it remains committed to upholding sovereignty and territorial integrity. It wants to maintain its relationship with Russia, and it also wants to maintain its relationships in the West. That's a very difficult balancing act, and the longer the war goes, the harder that balancing act is going to become for Beijing.
And Beijing, Xi Jinping, is watching everything that's happening in Ukraine. He sees the economic sanctions. He also sees unity within NATO. And I'm wondering, is that influencing his calculus when it comes to the future of Taiwan?
It's a very important question. I think, and there are many lessons that one can draw. My sense is that China recognizes now, given the difficulties that given the military difficulties that Russia has had invading a territorially contiguous neighbor, imagine how much harder it would be for China to stage an amphibious landing. Staging an amphibious landing is orders of magnitude more difficult in the military pecking order, number one. Number two, for all of China's much vaunted military modernization, it's important to remember that the People's Liberation Army hasn't fought in major combat since 1979, number two. Number three, China is also recognizing with the sanctions that the West has imposed on Russia that Russia's so-called fortress economy is not as impregnable as Moscow might have imagined. So China recognizes that if it were to contemplate any aggression against Taiwan, it would have to do a lot more work in advance to build up its economic self-reliance, to build up its technological reliance self-reliance. It's nowhere near there. So I think that it's not to say that, China had been intimidating Taiwan, increasing its pressure against Taiwan well before Russia launched its invasion of Ukraine. So it's not as though it's not as though Russia's behavior in Ukraine is going to establish or determine what China does. But China is learning lessons. And I think that China is recognizing that the military costs that it would incur, the economic costs that it would incur from aggression against Taiwan would be very severe, that it has a lot more work to do to build up its military and economic strength.
Ali Wine with the Eurasia Group. Ali, it's good talking with you. Excellent analysis. We appreciate your time and your insights tonight. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, it's said that the British people are experts in the art of queuing. Thousands have been doing what they do best, standing in line for hours, even sleeping in line during the night to say a final goodbye to Queen Elizabeth. Britain's longest-serving monarch is lying in state in London's Westminster Hall for the next 4 days. The queue to see her coffin stretches out the door for nearly 10 kilometers along the River Thames. You see it right there. It's so long that there is a website now that shows you where the end of the line is. Those already in line, we're told, are issued wristbands so that they can leave if they have to maybe sit down or go to the bathroom or get something to eat. Officials expect 750,000 people to file past before the Queen's funeral, which is scheduled for this coming Monday. All right, let's find out a little more about what's motivating these huge crowds standing in line to view the Queen's casket. I want to bring in royal commentator Richard Fitzwilliams. He joins me tonight from London. Mr. Fitzwilliams, it's good to have you with us. The pictures that the world is seeing right now, the fact that people have been prepared and are prepared to wait up to 30 hours outside September, and we know what London weather is like, to view the Queen lying in state. What does that tell us?
It tells us that the Queen was a truly remarkable individual who had, I think, the best way of describing her relationship with her subjects, I think, is love. I'm reminded of her distinguished predecessor from the 16th century, Elizabeth I, who in her golden speech said, "Though God hath raised me high, I count the glory of my throne that I have reigned with your love." And I think that that is so apt in this particular case, because the longest ever reigning monarch and someone who was part and parcel of so much of British life. As you say, the queues at the moment stretching for all these amazing hours. Of course, hundreds of thousands queued when the Queen Mother died in 2002, and also, of course, for the funeral of, and when George VI, her father, Britain's wartime sovereign, was lying in state. But this is something, the like of which, leading on to Monday, where there's a bank holiday, and of course the funeral, and world leaders will descend on London. It's unlike anything I think we'll have ever seen, possibly excepting Sir Winston Churchill's funeral in 1965.
And it has been such a somber week in the UK. We're seeing these long queues of people, and there has been almost no interruptions, no one misbehaving, no one protesting. I mean, they say there's signs of reverence and respect all along these queues along the River Thames at the moment. How has the passing of the Queen tapped into what seems to be a deep root of dignity in the public?
Yes, you're quite right using that word dignity, because I think it's important. I mean, you cannot really do other than completely contrast what we're seeing now with the Queen dying at 96 with, for example, the Princess of Wales at 36, where suddenly the floodgates opened when it came to emotion, and the British had decided themselves we'd never seen before. As this, people are responding individually in different ways. For example, quite a large number are shedding tears. Quite a large number are clapping. A very large number, as in the age of social media, are taking selfies and using iPhones. Some people think it's undignified. Some people think that, well, this is the way they want to remember the occasion. It's certainly a very, very quiet procession, and the feeling is that this is a unique chance that they'll be looking back in decades to come, and no one will forget where they were when they heard of the Queen's passing, and also this moment, the lucky few who will be able to get in, as you say, there'll be several 100,000 into Westminster Hall, the oldest part of the House of Commons.
That's right.
Which in fact dates as earliest since William II. The roof was Richard II. It survived the 1845-44 power in Parliament, and also the Blitz, and Churchill's coffin also laid.
Mr. Fitzwilliams, before we run out of time, I just want to ask you, regarding the funeral and the challenge this must be on a diplomatic level. I mean, who's coming and who has not been invited? Do we know?
We do most certainly know that world heads of state have been invited, but the exceptions are Russia, Belarus, and Myanmar. And apparently also there are Venezuela and Syria. And apparently there are a few countries, I think, including North Korea, who will be asked to send or be invited to send ambassadors. So what in reality this will mean is that there will be one of the largest ever gatherings outside the United Nations, say, of world leaders. As though it's important because, of course, Queen Elizabeth, the Queen of Britain, who nurtured the Commonwealth in the way she did, was herself a citizen of the world in the sense that she was able, with her profile, to reach out to people uniquely. We saw this when Britain suffered under the pandemic, and she was able to quote her Britain's wartime sweetheart, Dame Vera Lynn, so brilliantly. She was better known than any other head of state. This will pay tribute to her amazing life.
Royal commentator Richard Fitzwilliams. Mr. Fitzwilliams, we appreciate your time and your valuable insights into what is an incredibly historic time in the UK. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, the day is almost done. The conversation, it continues online. You'll find us on Twitter, either at DW News. You can follow me on Twitter at Brent Goff TV. And remember, whatever happens between now and then, tomorrow is another day. We'll see you then.